Okay, so this video comes with a kind of a warning. So I've been putting up a lot of different, pieces, segments up on YouTube in the last, month or so, and a lot of them, I'm trying to really take as many concepts as possible and sort of just unpack them, and then figure out exactly if we can get to a more clear and nuanced understanding. And I hope, and from the feedback I've been getting, it sounds like a lot of all of you people out in the inside of the camera have been challenged somewhat and trying to understand, and it's something which is definitely pushing the limits and the boundaries of what it is that you thought before, and now when you get exposed to this way of thinking, it kind of starts to really broaden the perspective. So I'm very happy to hear about all that. But this video is kind of like a step that goes way past that, or way past, but significantly past that. And so it comes with a little bit of a warning, which is I really want you to sort of take this video kind of slow and think it through as you go, piece by piece. And there's going to be a few pieces that are kind of part of this whole thought process and discussion here. And that's because we are kind of going to the edge of where the logical side of our minds is able to really operate properly. So that's it's a warning, because the more you kind of go into that area towards the edge, then the easier it, or the more prone you are to starting to really get, I don't want to just say confused because it's confusing information. It's that it actually can start to stress your thoughts and your mind. I've had students that, they would hear some of these things and they would start to cry from them. Students who were just shocked and unable to continue in the class or in learning these things for some time because it was difficult for them. And so we're really going to the place that's the edge of what you can think about logically, and then that's a pretty big problem, because it kind of leaves you with very few tools that you can use to deal with the new knowledge that I'm really trying to share here in this particular segment. So with that as a foreboding type of warning in the beginning, we're gonna just try to talk about essentially the question of the story of what people tend to call the story of creation in the Chumash, in the Bible, in the Torah. And the story is, it's the thing we're really going to deal with here in this piece, at least, is what exactly is the meaning of what we say in English very very casually, this 6 days of creation. And 6 days of creation, the phrase in English, it's one of those types of things that does not in any way describe what's actually going on. You can think of it almost like nowadays, the way we talk about it, it's kind of sad, because there's, I teach in high school, and there's like a lot of debates there, and there's debates really, all over the place, non-Jewish world, secular world, the Jewish world. Do we really believe the world was created in 6 days? The universe seems to be 15 billion years old, according to some techniques of measurement, and other theories about how the universe works. And we have the Big Bang theory and energy and matter, and how does that fit together with fundamentalist Bible perspectives? Which those types of debates come in with like this preconceived assumption that like there is actually a perspective that is legitimate, that there are 6 days of creation, like just 6 days, and then we suddenly have this, and it really, if the more you learn about the actual texts and the information that we have about what went on during the process of creation, like I would argue that the bulk of the writings that we have really focus on the stories of what's called Maaseh Bereshis, the actual the initializing phase of the universe, which is what we mean when we say creation. And then we have a lot of other segments that talk about what's called Maaseh Merkava, which is sort of like how do you actually encase Hashem's presence within you as you live your life, which is it's really kind of like part 2. And and then everything else, all the halacha and the gemaras that we learn and that are more popularized, are all just the tail end of those two things. They're just the externalizing, the practicals, and they're the external expression of those things. But when you realize that that's the bulk of the writings that we have is about those two things, sort of like where everything came from, and then how do we take it and live that and embody it. So then the debate kind of changes dramatically, and suddenly there's not really anymore this the straw man of well, there's this versus that, and religion versus science, or those kinds of perspectives. So you can think of it almost as nowadays, because we really know so little Torah, we know so little of our actual Torah, which is funny because we're learning Torah now historically more than we have for a long time. But our knowledge of Torah is on a steep decline. and at the same time our knowledge of the world and science and whatever is on an incline. And so we have these two things kind of like, I don't know how to do that with my hands, but one is going up, one is going down. So you used to know Torah really, really deeply. Over the last 3,000 years, our knowledge of Torah was very deep and profound, and then it's been declining slowly. And then our knowledge of the world coming through science now seems it's like on an incline, and we're learning so much about that. And the irony is that when you understand that if you think that the Torah is real, if you genuinely think the Torah is real and that it's true, so then you should think that it's true in its totality. And one of the things that the Torah says, and that we have midrashim that describe this much more at length, is that it's simply a description of the truth of the universe. So if the Torah is a description of the truth of the universe, so then if we find out based on science, which just means analytical tools applied to the universe, and you see that it seems like the universe might be 15 billion years old, so then that implies that the Torah should relate to that somehow, because the Torah is a reflection of reality, and that's what science says. So then there's got to be some truth. In other words, the universe, how does the universe work? How does it exist? So people tend to think about it like this. They'll say, well, there's God, Hashem, whatever word you want to use, and then Hashem has superpowers. So he's magical. So what does it mean that Hashem is magical? Well, what Hashem does is when he speaks, so then things happen. So what does that mean? Hashem will say, let there be light. And because he's so magically powerful, so when he says, let there be light, so what happens? Suddenly, there's light. And that's all. That all takes one day. It takes one day. People don't bother asking, well, it takes one day to do that. So how long does it take Hashem to speak the words, let there be light, right? So it says, let there be light. So that takes about, a second and a half. And then he's so powerful, so it should be we all know he's super powered, so it's instantaneous. And then what happens after that? So I guess the rest of the day Hashem's just chilling, and nothing else is happening that day. And then day 2, it's now he's got to get to work. Now we have to make the sky and the ground, and there's water everywhere, and all these weird things are happening. And so that's day 2. So there Hashem's really busy. But you'll notice that day 7, the text says that day 7, because the word does not mean day, but I'm just going to use the language that people like to use. Hashem does actually seem to stop doing stuff on day 7. So if he stopped, and it seemed like it was pretty significant there that he stopped. So wouldn't it mention, well, on day 1, Hashem did this, and then he's okay, that was enough for the first day, and now we're going to take a little break. So that's strange to think that that was day 1. But that's how I think a lot of us think about this. That that's the deal with God. I just recently somebody asked me a question. They said, why does Hashem have all of these tools that it seems like he uses? A lot of books describe all these parts of the universe. One of them is what we call in Hebrew malachim. In English, people like to mistranslate that as angels. So why are there all these forces and tools like malachim that Hashem uses to create the universe and to operate the universe? He's God, so he's super powered. He could just be let there be light, and it just happens, and it's magical. He could make the whole universe that way. He doesn't need any methods to make the universe work. It's just he just makes it work, and that's it, because he's super powerful, and that's what it is. So that whole approach, that's how to think about God. That's well, he spoke, let there be light, and then let there be this, let there be that, and that's how those things came into being. Because when Hashem speaks, stuff just happens, because things just listen to him. So that there's a bunch of different flaws with that whole way of thinking. I just presented a couple of them, and what I want to show is that it's not, you don't even need to get on to explaining why they're so flawed. There are so many flaws that we could spend a whole hour just delineating the flaws. But you don't need to do that, because the more you learn about what the text is saying, the more you see clearly that that's not even what's happening. So, and I'm going to show how that's true. I'll just mention there's a statement in Pirkei Avos, which is a section of the Mishnayos of Shas, of all the Torah Shebaal Peh that we have. So there's a statement that describes that Hashem actually, Ba'asar Ma'amaros, Hashem actually created the world. With 10 sayings, that's how usually that's translated. I'm going to try to show you that that's not what that's talking about. There's no saying. It's not like Hashem is talking now, and that suddenly makes stuff just come into being and just happen in that way. So let's sort of start to analyze this a little bit more carefully. So the first thing I want to sort of do is just explain how the things that the text says, when it says that Hashem is speaking, so that's one of a few, really a fairly large number, but we're just going to do a few examples of things you have to read a little bit more smartly and carefully. And it's not because we're going to try to apologetically rewrite the things that the text is saying to make that mean something else. It's because the text says stuff and it means something, and then when you shove in your translation in a different way, then you're now not reading the text anymore. You're just reading yourself. You're hearing your own ideas and shoving them into the words. So just to pick one, just to start with the Asar Mamaros, the 10 sayings that Hashem used to create reality. So let's just focus on that for a second. The word Vayomer, that's the word that's used in the text. So the word Vayomer is usually translated as, and he said. Okay, we have two words for speaking in the Torah. One is the word Vayomer, and the one is the word Vaidaber. Not only two words, but let's say for now, two main words. So the word Vayomer usually means and he said. The word Vaidaber, I once heard someone translate it as and he spoke, as if like there's a serious difference of nuance there. So let's think about that a little more carefully and just use some source material for that. The word Vayomer shows up very often in the Chumash, a lot of times. All over the Bible, you'll find it many, many times. In Parshas Ki Tavo, Sefer Dvarim, so towards the end of the Chumash, you'll find that the root, Amar, Aleph Mem Resh, which is the root of the word Vayomer, so that root is used in a way that's extremely unusual, difficult to kind of explain or describe. So let's just take a look at what that root actually is and, see if we can analyze it. So listen to how the word is used, okay, the root. So the text says, Et Hashem he'emarta hayom. You have been he'emar, you are ma'amir Hashem today. Okay, liot lecha le'elohim, to be for you an Elokim. Ve'leches bedrachav, to go in his way, and tells you a few more things you're going to do. You're basically v'lishmoa bekolot, to sort of listen to what Hashem says. So you are ma'amir Hashem today. You were ma'amir him, whatever that word means. Again, ma'amir is the root, Aleph Mem Resh, same root as the word Vayomer. So you're going to be ma'amir Hashem. That's what you did today, to make him like your Elokim, to listen to what he says, to live in his way, to sort of imitate him and channel him. That's really the Maaseh Merkava concept, which we're not going to go into right now. And then that's what you did. And then it says V'Hashem ha'emir chayom, and Hashem was ma'amir you. Also, liyoso la'am segula, that you should be for him like this special group of people. That's what he did for you, just like he said he would do. Okay, so he was ma'amir you, and you were ma'amir him. And if you look at the context of that, so just to analyze it a little thoughtfully, so what's happening here is it says that you were ma'amir Hashem to make him. You were ma'amir him to make him your Elokim, your set of powers that you look to, and you're going to listen to him. You're going to live in his way. You're going to bring him in your life. That's what you did. You were ma'amir Hashem for that, and Hashem was ma'amir you to be your Am Segula, to be his Am Segula, to be his special group of people. So if you just try to think what English word or words you could try to shove in to explain in the context what that word means. So, you could think of Hashem singled you out, you singled out Hashem, you chose Hashem, you distinguished Hashem, you differentiated Hashem, you separated Hashem from other Elohims, and Hashem separated you from other groups and made you his special group. So that's what it sounds like the word means, which, by the way, is exactly what Rashi and the Midrashim that Rashi is working with here say that's what the word means. It means to differentiate. Now, then the question is, well, why would the word for differentiating also be the same word as the word for speaking? It's a strange thing, right? Why would that be true? So if you think about that a little carefully, you'll realize that makes complete sense. That anytime you are omer something, you are in fact going through the process of differentiating. The reason why we don't think about this so much is because we tend to not think too carefully about what it is that we are doing when we speak. And what's funny about speaking is that it's incredibly profound. The fact that you can speak is probably, I don't think it's the most underratedly profound activity that you can engage in, but it's definitely up there in the top 5. Because what are you doing when you're speaking? So we already have spoken about in other segments that you are essentially this self that is behind or within or beyond the body and the set of tools that you use. And then what you do is you're trying to sort of use the body to reach across the distance between this body and the body of somebody else, or the distance of the bodies that are now on the other side of this camera lens. And you're reaching across to try to now create a bridge that connects us, that I can now connect to you, which now, if you do that intensely enough, that connection is called ahava. That's, people translate it as love. So what you're doing when you speak is what you're basically taking the undifferentiated you, the self that is pure and one, and not a particular. It's not your body's gender. It's not your sense of humor. It's not your way that how smart you are or how nice you are. It's none of those things. The self is the you that's beyond all of that, and then uses things like your humor and your niceness and your gender and your body in all the different ways, but you're the self that's beyond all that. And then you take that you, and you then try to use the mind, and the thoughts that you have, and the feelings that you have, and then the muscles and the nerves that you have to create sounds with your mouth that vibrate the air in patterns that are recognizable by the person across the way. And then that person is able to get a sense of you, the self, through those words. What you're doing is you're trying to differentiate the undifferentiated you into containers and boxes and ideas that then go to the other person. That is what speaking is. And the reason why it's so profound is because we have no understanding scientifically or in any way, even within the Torah, there's a structure that we can describe, but we do not have the access to the power or the knowledge yet of how the self is actually tethered to the mind and the body and all the parts of this tool that we use. So when you speak, what you're doing is you are essentially using that profound bridging of the self through to the tools and then putting that out there into the world. That's a very, very incredible, again, inexplicable phenomenon. So that's what differentiating means here. When you're vayomer something, you are differentiating things. So when you say, oh, Hashem spoke things into existence, when you say that you spoke, so you're really just describing it in this very vague, superficial way. It doesn't really mean anything. You spoke. What you really mean is, I somehow magically, in a way that is inexplicable, not magically, but inexplicably, as an undifferentiated self that is beyond all of this body and all being in a certain way, I somehow managed to translate myself into a differentiated format that now is able to be put into a finite world that's full of differentiation. So that's what you mean when you say I spoke. So that's a pretty specific definition of the meaning of speaking. So now when you think about that carefully, so then if we talk about Hashem is, quote, creating the world, the universe with 10 ma'amaros. So now what that really means is that Hashem is essentially, even if we keep using the word creating, which is not really what the word bara means, but we'll leave that alone. So Hashem created all of the universe that you know and that you encounter through 10 differentiations. In other words, 10, differentiating processes where he basically took himself as an endless self that is somehow, beyond or not tangible, not part of the world, and not part of the universe in a tangible way, and differentiated that into a differentiated structural multiplicity, diversity of all the things that are around us. So that's what the word vayomer means. So now when we sort of start looking at that, that really starts to change sort of how we might think about the process as it is described in the Torah in terms of, the creation story. Because now it doesn't really mean anymore that we're talking about God. Well, God just spoke things into existence. That's not what's happening. What we're describing is that Hashem actually underwent a process of differentiation to sort of convert or differentiate himself into the diversity you see around you. And you are actually an analogy for Hashem. You're built in what's called Tselem Elokim. So if you think about what that means, so Tselem Elokim means you have an analogous set of tools and format. So just like you take your undifferentiated self and you differentiate it into the words you use and also the actions that you take in your self-expression. So Hashem also, or you are the also, Hashem is the original, and all of the universe is essentially created and differentiated that way into the diversity that you see and experience and encounter around you. Okay, so let's think about that a little more carefully now. Well, so when there's all these different layers of differentiation or processes of differentiation, so you might want to ask, well, what was there before the differentiation happened? What would that be like if you could imagine that? So I'm going to just give you the Arizal, who's the one of the big Kabbalah writers of the last 500 years, 600 years, and he basically took all of the Kabbalah thought and organized it and put it all together, integrated all of it into its parts, kind of similar to what Rav Kook did in the last 100 years. But Rav Kook kind of did it with the Arizal's writings. So the Arizal did it with everybody else's writings. And there are people in every few, 100 years that really made massive impacts in terms of just taking ideas that were all over the place, and that, because writing is chaotic, and there's, some writings don't survive, other writings do. And so he basically collected and then compiled, and both in his own mind and also his own writings, and his student that wrote up a lot of his writings. So I just want to use his description of things. So just the way he described it is that in the beginning, or in the initial start point, which you can think of as ground zero of space and time. So all there was this ocean. You can think of it as an ocean of undifferentiated light. That's the language that's used. It's called Or Ein Sof, It's all homogeneous, all the same, all just undifferentiated light. And then what happens is that or Ein Sof, that's an analogy for the light of Hashem's consciousness. And then Hashem basically went through a series of stages where he essentially stepped himself down. You can think about it like almost if you have a very, very bright light, so you need to sort of like put some lenses and coverings in front of it to sort of step down the intensity, and that kind of allows for the light to be, you can kind of look at it then. It's kind of like, looking at the sun directly without any kind of lens to block it, it's going to be very difficult. It'll burn out your retina. But if you start getting covering lenses, that allows you to actually gaze at the sun, if you have enough coverings on there, and then there's room for you to exist kind of in opposition with the sun and sort of like directly looking at the sun. So that's exactly how it's described, that in the Arizal's writings, that Hashem essentially put these coverings on top of his, like this undifferentiated light, and those coverings actually acted like a prism. And what that means is that the prism kind of took the light and fragmented it into different textures and colors, and what we call, the diversification process, where the homogeneous light suddenly becomes refracted and differentiated into many, many, many colors. And those colors we don't just mean literal colors because light is color. We mean that actually those are energies that are sort of like basically generated and differentiated through that process. And then some of those energies are condensed, and that's exactly what's described. That energy and that light of Hashem essentially was condensed down into what we call matter. And so like when you see things, like atoms conglomerated into a structure like this, the popular pillow that's starting to show up in every video. So maybe I should try selling this pillow. So, some swag from the video series. But like when you see things like that, so that's actually matter that's just condensed energy in a particular form. That's what atoms are. That's why if you take atoms and you rip them apart, and they explode, and they create nuclear bombs. So that's like a pretty intense explosion from tiny things. You take a little, some purified uranium, and you rip it apart like that, bang, you destroy an entire city. That's because matter is actually a very, very condensed and dense form of energy. So that's pretty wild if you think about that, because that kind of means that like all of the universe that we see is either actual energy in the energy form, which is what we call radiation, all kinds of different frequencies of radiation. And then you also have matter, which is just energy in condensed form. And so that's like, that's kind of when you start learning about that in science and in physics, you're like, wow, that's crazy, because the Arizal wrote that process like, hundreds of years ago, and he's basing it on earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier source materials that go back 3,000 years ago and more, okay, even more than that. So that's a pretty crazy thing to find out and to notice. So if all that is kind of what's going on, well then that kind of means that the process that we're reading about in the Chumash about Hashem creating the world, even just reading, like I said, the word Vayomer, is already, and you start learning about these things that the Arizal is saying. So like, where did the Arizal get that? Well, when he read the Chumash, he didn't think to himself, oh, you know what, the word Vayomer means and he spoke, so like, that's just what it means. He didn't have that, because what he does is he reads the Chumash, knows the whole thing, knows the source that I showed you already in Parshas Ki Tavo, and then he's kind of like, yeah, well, that's just like, he knows what the word Vayomer means. He also read all these other source materials and books about this stuff. So at a certain point, like, it's very hard to not see that. It's like so obvious when you read the text and you have all that information that that's like the story that's going on. But then when we come to the table today and we know, like, how many people today know the Chumash by heart? I mean, in the English-speaking world, there's just really not a lot. And then, even to know certain parts of it relatively well, it's rare. But like to actually, know the Chumash. So, and then to know all the cross connections of different words and where they intersect, and then and the cross check analyses of these different words. Like, this is not just stuff that we're making up nowadays to make like nice Dvar Torahs. These are things that were known that for thousands of years. And so, when we come to the table today with our idea that it just means that God spoke, so like that's something which there's no such thing as that. So now, when you start to read the text further, so, the next phase of this is, well, how do we deal with the fact that it says that it uses the word yom, right? Like it says there's yom echad, yom sheni, all these different yoms that are going on in the story of creation. So how do we deal with that? So once again, now when you're reading the text, you got to think about, well, what does the word yom actually mean? So how do you know the word yom means day? So the answer to that is that we find in many places inside of the Chumash that the word yom does mean day. But the tricky part about that is that it really doesn't seem like it could mean day in this situation already because of the example that I mentioned in the beginning, right? Like the first day, so if that's a 24-hour period, so then that's very odd that would be like that on that day. So Hashem created light. Now, even if you at this point you could start to try to solve that. You could say, well, Hashem differentiated energy in the way that we've been describing until now. So that's what the first Yom was about, Hashem differentiating himself into this ore that is now a receivable energy that then essentially then converts into all the things you see in the world around you, all the matter that you see, and the energy that's also found in the universe. So maybe that took a whole day for Hashem to do that, 24 hours. But like even that sounds a little weird. Like why would Hashem restrict himself to 24-hour periods to engage in this type of process of differentiation? And why does each part take the same amount of time? It's like kind of random, right? And we're so used to it because we're just like, well, what do you mean there's 6 days of creation? But like if you're Hashem and you don't know, you're kind of working with the story and you're developing reality. So like why would that be the way that you did it? Like what's the underlying reason for that? Now, if you can find a reason in the text for that, that's nice, but there doesn't seem to be one. And it just the word Yom is what we are pretty much hinging our idea that this actually happened in 6 days. So why are we doing that? Now, when you go a little further, so the word Yom also kind of looks very similar to another word. And that other word is the word Yam. So that's where things start to get a little more interesting now, because the word Yam usually translates as ocean. That's how we like to translate it. It's a nice, fun word to use. But think about it a little more for a second. Like the word, and by the way, the plural of Yam is Yamim, which is also the plural of days. It means Yamim also. It's like that's the same thing. So that's a very clear parallelism between them. But just think for a second about the concept of Yam. So first of all, in the Torah and the Medrash, the Yam is associated or conceptualized as a body of water that is endless. It's called Maim She'ein Lahem Sof. These are like endless waters. That's what a Yam is kind of describing. Now, and there's a lot of different applications of that. So it's not just like a one-time thing where it's just called Yam, just means kind of like endless waters. The concept of a Yam is waters that just kind of seem like they go on. Because they go to the horizon, they seem like they go on and on forever. So that's what the word Yam sort of like has a connotation of that. Now, the other thing that's interesting about Yam is that, we have something called Mayim. Mayim is water. Now, why would it be called Mayim? Like, what's the reason for that word? Now, when you look at the word Mayim, so that word actually is mi-yam. It means we're taking from the Yam, which is what you're doing, right? When you take water, so, it's like you're taking water from the Yam. So now we're not drinking water from the ocean, because usually water that you take is not from the ocean, literally. So why would we call it like mi-yam, like from the Yam? So think about it for a second. Oh, another part to think about also with the word Mayim is that it seems like it's plural, right? It's like Mayim, like it's a plural word, because the yim at the end, the yud mem at the end, is a plural suffix at the end of the word in Hebrew. So like, why would that be a plural word, Mayim? Like we're taking waters. Here's some waters. So like, if you think about that a little carefully, so water, at least to the natural eye, is a homogeneous mass, right? Like all water is the same, essentially, in terms of the water component. Now, of course, there's different, you can have different suspensions in water. You could have water that has salt suspended in it. You can have water that has mud suspended in it. But the water itself is a homogeneous mass. And the molecular level, that's certainly true. And also on the conceptual level, like water is all pretty much the same. It's all water. And so when you take some water and you have some water, that's some of the water that's the water that is. Like just like when you take some water, you're having some waters. So that just means if you have a cup of water, so now you're just taking out some of the waters that exist and you're putting it in this cup. But it's the same as those waters too. And all the waters are just the same waters. And they're all homogeneous, and you're taking some of them. So that's why you're taking them, Mayim is mi-yam. I'm going to take some of this from it, and now I have some of it, but it's still, just the same as that. It's just more of that. So you have like, and it's kind of like, well, if I have a full cup, so like, is that waters? Or if I have a half a cup, is that waters? When does it go from being singular, like water, to waters? So in Hebrew, it never becomes singular, because it's always Mayim, which means it's always plural, because it's always just some of that. And like the sum is like like there's amounts, and like however you want to count the units of that, it's basically difficult to do. But like there's basically the Yam itself, which is one giant homogeneous mass. And then you have, you can sort of like take some of it, and it's separated from that. So why would that be the word for the word Yom? So let's think about that a little further then. Maybe the reason for that is because what exactly are we saying? Like Yam is like this homogeneous mass, like kind of like anything which is not Yam, which is not part of that homogeneous mass. So like that's, separate from the Yam. There's the Yam and there's other things. So we have like, land and trees and animals. And then we have Yam, a homogeneous mass. So if you think about that for a second, that's kind of like everything that's in the Yam, all the waters that are in there, it's all the same. It's all one thing. That's like one block, one space, like one unit, if you want to think about it like that. And if you think about that a little carefully, I think that's exactly what the word yom means. The word yom does not mean day. See, we think of it as day because we're like, well, we have days. And then we're like, well, that's yom. And we see that. So we kind of shove our experience of that into the most, and since it usually works well in the Torah, because places where the word yom is used does sometimes refer to our day. But the word yom actually sounds like what it really means is the concept of a phase. Like there are phases. And so, a unit, there's like unit 1, and then like unit 2, and like different units are structured differently because every unit has its, particular setup. So if you think about that, so like, first of all, like that would just explain a different problem, which is that the sun and the rising and the setting of the sun and, the timing of the sun at the earliest only started to really exist in the process of creation on day 4. So to say that Hashem is kind of like tracking his creation process, his differentiation process, really, according to a sun which doesn't exist yet, so that's kind of weird because it just isn't there. So why would he do that? So, but even when you sort of take that, this sort of solves that because it's like, well, the phases that Hashem is using for his process of differentiation are nothing to do with the movement of the sun that we have. It's something which is, we're talking about something which is much more fundamental than that, and then we describe our phases of our lives according to that same word. The word yom means phase. So that really, I think, is just a good beginning to sort of thinking about this, which is that you have to sort of realize there's a very large story behind this, and that there's a lot of information here, and that the idea that there's like a process of creation that like God just speaks and says things like that is something which is very it's really not what's happening. In other words, that's a very primitive and sort of like immature, and again, it's also kind of coming from the Christian perspective. So I think that pretty much lays down the fundamentals of how to think about creation as not really being about just random creation in a way that's just God is powerful and magical. Now, that also lays the groundwork for the next discussion, which is once we say all of this, so you sort of have to start asking questions about like, well, when you go back to the beginning of that differentiation process, so what exactly does it look like? How did that happen? And that's really where we have to start talking about what's called, people call this today, the Big Bang. And the Big Bang seems to be like this, this explosion where like at first there was nothing, and then there was this giant explosion which suddenly became something, and that's, that's the Big Bang. And we essentially have to then figure out, well, is there such a thing as the Big Bang? What does it look like if you'd be standing there at that time? And a big part of that is really where it starts to really get very edgy in terms of your mind, because when you try to journey back in your mind to that point, so you have to realize, as just a beginning example, that Hashem is the source of time, and he's the source of space, and those are linear. The idea of time and space are what gives us a linear, logical way of being. In other words, when you have space and time, you can think of, well, first there was this, and then after that in time, there was this, and that was all taking place in space. That's where those changes were happening. First this, then this, then this, then this. And so, we have this concept of time and space, but those are things that Hashem also creates or differentiates into. So what that means is that like there's also time is actually an entity. It's not like time is like a given that's always there, and Hashem is kind of like in time decides to start the process of creation, and before that there was it was earlier, so like he just didn't start yet, but like that was like before. There is no such thing as before when time itself is a construct. So that's where we have to really start to go to think about that. And there's a lot of parts of that also in terms of physics, because you have the physics concepts that are being unearthed today are concepts that are and have been written about in Kabbalah for thousands of years. So our description of the Big Bang is way more expressed and expanded and sophisticated than any description of the Big Bang that I've ever read, and in the secular literature. And second of all, so just to sort of realize that like there's serious problems here of thinking about this, because like how do you start a cause and effect series of events, which is what time is, the unfolding of time and space? How do you start that cause and effect when there's no time in the beginning? Like how do you begin that? Like, you can't begin if there's no time, but like you have to start somewhere. So like, where do you start? How does that even work? So that's really where we start to get a much clearer idea of who Hashem is, and relative to us, who are we? And then, we kind of go from there to understanding a little bit more about this process. But we're going to do that in the next part, part 2 of this series, and it's going to really try to explain then. Okay, so that's kind of what creation was. So then, what is the Big Bang? And then we're going to go from there also into like what exactly does that mean in terms of our understanding of the universe and timing. How long does this take? And what exactly is the point of this Big Bang process, or regular bang, or whatever this is? And what exactly is evolution? And all of these parts are kind of like all related to the question of time and the unfolding of the universe. So I hope that was useful and clear, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in part 2 of this little mini series.